Innocent man jailed for 20 years, but his mother's next move changed everything. The prison gates clanged shut behind him, the final echo of a life stolen in an instant. Nathan Carter stood motionless, his hands trembling as the reality of his sentence pressed down on him. 20 years. 20 years for a crime he hadn't committed. The courtroom's fluorescent lights had been harsh, but not as cruel as the faces that had condemned him. The jury, the judge, even his own defense attorney had looked at him like he was already guilty. Nathan had never been in trouble before. He wasn't the kind of man who got mixed up in things that could land him behind bars. At 24, he had worked 2 jobs, trying to build a future for himself and his mother, Margaret. He had dreams, big ones, of leaving their small Mississippi town and making something of himself. But all of that had vanished the moment the police came knocking at his door on a rainy evening, accusing him of a crime he hadn't even heard about until that moment. The trial had been quick, almost too quick. There had been no hard evidence, no fingerprints, no DNA, just the shaky testimony of a witness who later admitted she wasn't even sure. The prosecutor, hungry for a conviction, painted Nathan as a dangerous man, someone who fit the description, and the jury had been all too willing to believe it. His public defender barely put up a fight. When the judge uttered the words, 20 years to life, his mother's anguished cries had filled the courtroom. Margaret Carter had always been a fighter. She had raised Nathan and his younger sister, Olivia, on her own, working 2 jobs to keep them fed, clothed, and safe. She knew struggle. She had lived it her entire life. But nothing had prepared her for the day they took her son away. From the moment the verdict was read, she refused to accept it. She knew her son was innocent. She had raised him better than that. He wasn't perfect. No one was. But he was no criminal. And she was going to prove it, no matter what it took. At first, she tried the obvious routes. She met with lawyers, begged them to take another look at the case, pleaded with anyone who would listen. But they all told her the same thing. The trial was over. There was nothing they could do. The system had spoken. She wrote letters to anyone who might help. Journalists, politicians, Innocence Projects. Some wrote back, offering sympathy but little else. Others never responded. The years passed, and each time she visited Nathan in that cold, gray prison, she saw the light in his eyes dim a little more. He never said it out loud, but she knew he was losing hope. Then, one evening, as she sat alone at her kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of paperwork she had collected over the years, she saw something, a detail buried deep within the case files, something small but significant, a name, a piece of evidence that had been overlooked, ignored, or deliberately hidden. Her heart pounded as she read over it again and again, the words blurring through the tears filling her eyes. It was something real. And for the first time in years, Margaret felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Hope. She didn't know what kind of battle she was about to fight. She didn't know how powerful the people were who had let her son take the fall. But she didn't care, because she had spent 20 years knocking on doors that refused to open, and now she had a crowbar in her hands. Margaret Carter wasn't about to back down. Not now. Not ever. Margaret stared at the name scribbled in the margins of an old court document, her hands trembling. It was a detail she had overlooked before, buried under years of rejection, unanswered letters, and cold bureaucracy. But now, as she reread it under the dim kitchen light, she felt something stir inside her, something she hadn't felt in years. Determination. She pushed aside the unpaid bills and legal papers cluttering the table and reached for her phone. Her fingers hovered over the keypad. It was late, too late to call anyone, but she couldn't wait until morning. She needed answers. This name, this missing piece, was her first real lead in years. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to think clearly. She needed a plan. Nathan had spent the past 20 years rotting in a cell for a crime he didn't commit, and Margaret had spent every one of those years fighting for his freedom. At first, she had faith in the system. She had believed that if she just kept pushing, someone would listen. But no one had. Not the lawyers, not the judges, not the so-called innocence projects that promised to help cases like Nathan's. As the years passed, Margaret had watched her son change. The first time she visited him in prison, he was still Nathan, her Nathan. He had looked at her with the same warm brown eyes that had always reassured her, even as a child. But as time went on, that light faded. His letters became shorter. His voice, when she called, had grown distant. The walls of that prison weren't just keeping him inside, they were breaking him. She had tried to shield Olivia from it, too, but her daughter had grown up knowing the bitter truth. By the time she was a teenager, she had already learned that justice didn't come easy. Olivia had been 14 when Nathan was convicted, old enough to remember the way their mother had sobbed in the courtroom, clutching her brother's hand for the last time before they took him away. Now, Olivia was a grown woman with a life of her own, but she never stopped believing in Nathan's innocence. Margaret leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes. She thought back to the trial, the rushed investigation, the way the prosecutor had twisted the facts. She had sat in that courtroom and listened as they turned her son into a monster. They said he had been at the wrong place at the wrong time. They said he fit the description. They never cared about the truth. But now she had something. The name she had found. It belonged to a witness who had never testified. Someone who had been listed in early reports but had somehow disappeared from the final case file. Someone who might have seen what really happened that night. Margaret wasn't a lawyer, and she wasn't an investigator. She was just a mother. But if there was one thing she knew how to do, it was fight. She grabbed her coat and her keys. She had a witness to find. Margaret gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white as she drove through the empty streets of Oak Ridge. The name, Michael Reynolds, kept repeating in her head. He had been listed in the initial police report as someone who had been near the scene of the crime, but for some reason his statement had never been used in court. She pulled up in front of an old brick apartment complex on the outskirts of town. The address she had found next to his name in a decades-old report. The building looked run down, with flickering lights in the hallway and peeling paint on the doors. Taking a deep breath, she knocked. No answer. Margaret knocked again, harder this time. After a moment, the door creaked open, and a man in his late 40s stood before her. He had tired eyes, a graying beard, and the wary look of someone who had spent a lifetime keeping his head down. "Michael Reynolds?" she asked, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. His eyes flickered with something, recognition maybe, or hesitation. "Who's asking?" "My name is Margaret Carter. My son, Nathan, was convicted 20 years ago for a murder he didn't commit. Your name was in the police reports, but you never testified. I need to know why." Michael's face darkened, and he moved to shut the door. Margaret caught it with her hand. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "I've spent 20 years trying to free my son. If you know something, anything, I need to hear it." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, with a heavy sigh, he stepped aside. "Come in." The apartment was small and cluttered, the air thick with the smell of old cigarettes. Michael sat on the edge of a stained couch, rubbing his hands together. "I remember that night," he said finally. "I was outside the diner when it happened. I saw the guy who did it." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. "And it wasn't Nathan?" Michael shook his head. "No. The guy I saw was taller, heavier. He had a scar on his cheek. But when the cops questioned me, they didn't care. They already had their guy, your son." Margaret's stomach turned. "Why didn't you testify?" Michael let out a bitter laugh. "Because they didn't let me. I told the detective what I saw, but he told me I must have been mistaken. Then he stopped calling. When I tried to follow up, they brushed me off. Eventually, I got the message. Keep quiet." Margaret's hands clenched into fists. "You could have saved him. You think I don't know that?" Michael's voice cracked. "I was scared. I was a nobody, just a guy with a record. They made it clear that if I kept pushing, I might end up in trouble myself." Margaret stood abruptly, her heart pounding. "You need to come forward now." If you testify... Michael cut her off with a shake of his head. It's been 20 years. No one's going to listen to me now. Margaret swallowed her frustration. Nathan is still in prison for something he didn't do. Please, if you could just... Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know, lady. That case was buried a long time ago. People don't want it dug up. Margaret narrowed her eyes. Well, I do. Michael hesitated, then nodded slowly. Give me some time to think about it. She wanted to demand more, but she knew pushing too hard could scare him off. So instead, she reached into her bag and handed him a piece of paper. That's my number. Don't take too long. As she stepped back out into the cold night air, her hands were shaking. She had finally found someone who could prove Nathan's innocence. But now, she had to make sure he didn't disappear again. Margaret barely slept that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. She had found a witness, a man who had seen the real killer. But what if he got scared and disappeared again? What if he changed his story? She couldn't afford to lose him, not when she was this close. By morning, she was already on the phone with Olivia. I found someone, she said the moment her daughter picked up. Olivia hesitated. Someone who can help Nathan? Yes, a witness. He saw what happened that night. Oh my God, Olivia breathed. That's huge, Mom. What do we do now? We get him to talk. Margaret drove across town to the local law office of Daniel Rhodes, a lawyer she had begged for help years ago. Back then, he had told her there was nothing he could do without new evidence. But now, she had it. Daniel was sitting behind his desk when she walked in, looking surprised to see her. Margaret, he said, setting down his coffee. It's been a while. She dropped the old police file on his desk. I found a witness who was ignored in Nathan's case. He saw the real killer. Daniel picked up the papers, scanning them. His expression darkened. Michael Reynolds? His name was in the original reports, but his statement wasn't used in court. Because the police buried it, Daniel exhaled sharply. If he's willing to come forward, we might have something. But after 20 years, it won't be easy. We'll need proof that his statement was deliberately ignored. Margaret nodded. I don't care how hard it is. I need Nathan home. But just as she was leaving, her phone rang. It was Michael. They found me, he said, his voice shaky. Margaret's stomach dropped. Who? I don't know, he whispered. But someone was outside my apartment last night, just sitting in a car, watching. Margaret's grip tightened on her phone. Michael, you need to stay safe. Where are you? I'm leaving town, he said. I can't do this. Wait, please. But the line went dead. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. Someone didn't want the truth to come out, and they were willing to scare a witness into silence to keep it buried. She wasn't just fighting for Nathan's freedom anymore. She was fighting against something bigger. Margaret stood frozen, gripping her phone as Michael's words echoed in her mind. They found me. Her worst fear had come true. This wasn't just a forgotten case. Someone was making sure it stayed buried. Without thinking, she dialed Michael's number again, straight to voicemail. She tried again. Nothing. Panic surged through her, but she forced herself to stay calm. Michael was scared, but if she lost him now, Nathan would never get out. She called Olivia next. Mom. Olivia answered. What's wrong? Michael's running, Margaret said. Someone's threatening him. There was silence on the other end before Olivia spoke. Who would even care after all these years? I don't know, Margaret admitted, but someone does. We have to find him before he disappears, Olivia said. Margaret was already ahead of her. She rushed back to Michael's apartment, praying he was still there. But when she arrived, the door was open. The place was a mess. Papers scattered, drawers pulled out. It looked like someone had left in a hurry. Her heart pounded. Had they gotten to him first? She turned and nearly screamed when a figure stepped out from the shadows of the hallway. It was Daniel Rhodes. "I figured you'd come here," he said, looking grim. "Margaret, we need to talk." "Did you know about this?" she demanded. "I suspected," he admitted. "I looked deeper into the original case last night. The lead detective, Carter Mills, had a history of coercing confessions, manipulating evidence. If he buried Michael's statement, it wasn't a mistake. It was intentional." Margaret's stomach twisted. "And now someone is making sure Michael stays quiet." Daniel nodded. "This case isn't just about Nathan's conviction anymore. If we push this, we could be exposing a system that's been covering up wrongful convictions for years." Margaret squared her shoulders. "Then we push." Daniel exhaled. "That's what I was hoping you'd say." Margaret's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Meet me at the old train station. Come alone." Her breath caught. It had to be Michael. She looked up at Daniel. "I'm coming with you." Margaret shook her head. "If he sees a lawyer, he might run. I have to do this alone." Daniel hesitated, then relented. "Be careful." Margaret turned and walked out, her heart racing. She had spent 20 years fighting for Nathan. Now, she was walking straight into the fire, and she wasn't turning back. Margaret parked a block away from the old train station, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. The building had been abandoned for years, its walls covered in graffiti, windows boarded up. The platform was cracked, weeds growing between the slabs of concrete. A single, dim streetlight flickered nearby, casting eerie shadows. She checked her phone. No new messages. Michael was supposed to be here. Stepping out of the car, she pulled her coat tighter around her body, scanning the area. It was quiet, too quiet. Every instinct in her screamed that this was a bad idea, that she should turn back and call Daniel or Olivia. But she had come too far to walk away now. She stepped onto the platform. "Michael?" she called softly. A rustling noise came from the far end of the station. Margaret stiffened, turning toward the sound. Footsteps. Then, from the shadows, Michael emerged. His eyes darted around, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn jacket. He looked different from the man she had met days ago, his face gaunt, his movements jumpy. "I shouldn't be here," he muttered, stopping a few feet away from her. Margaret took a cautious step forward. "Michael, please. You're the only one who can help me prove Nathan's innocence." He exhaled sharply, glancing over his shoulder. "I don't think you get it, lady. This thing, it's bigger than just your son's case. People don't want this coming out." Margaret's throat tightened. "Who, Michael? Who's after you?" He hesitated, rubbing a hand over his face. "It's not just the old Detective Mills. He's gone, retired years ago. But the people he worked for, the ones who made sure cases like Nathan's were swept under the rug, they're still out there." Margaret swallowed hard. "Then we have to expose them." Michael let out a bitter laugh. "You think they'll let that happen? I already got a warning. A man came to my apartment last night. Big guy, scar on his cheek. Told me if I opened my mouth, I'd regret it." Margaret's stomach turned cold. "Did you recognize him?" Michael shook his head. "No, but he wasn't some random thug. He knew details about the case, stuff only cops or lawyers would know. Someone on the inside is still pulling strings." Margaret clenched her fists. "Then we bring it to the media. We go public. If the world is watching, they won't be able to silence us." Michael looked at her, his eyes filled with doubt. "You don't get it. If I do this, I'm putting myself in the crosshairs." Margaret stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. "And if you don't, Nathan spends the rest of his life in prison for something he didn't do." Michael exhaled shakily, his hands trembling. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, finally, he nodded. "Okay," he whispered. "I'll do it." Relief flooded Margaret. But before she could speak, the sound of tires screeching against pavement cut through the night. Both of them turned toward the road. A black SUV had pulled up near the station. The headlights were off, but Margaret could see the dark figures inside. Michael cursed under his breath. "They found me." Panic surged through Margaret's veins. "Run," she said. "Now." Michael didn't hesitate. He bolted toward the other end of the platform, disappearing into the darkness. Margaret spun on her heels, heading for her car. A car door slammed. Heavy footsteps echoed behind her. Someone was coming. Margaret ran. Margaret's pulse pounded in her ears as she sprinted toward her car. Behind her, the heavy footsteps grew louder. She didn't dare look back. If she hesitated, even for a second, she knew she wouldn't make it. Her car was just a few feet away. Digging into her pocket, she fumbled for the keys, her fingers trembling. A deep voice shouted behind her, "Stop!" Margaret ignored it. She yanked the car door open and threw herself inside, locking it just as a dark figure appeared in the side mirror. A man, broad-shouldered with a jagged scar running down his cheek. Her hands shook as she jammed the key into the ignition. The engine sputtered to life. A fist slammed against the driver's window. "You don't know what you're messing with, lady." Margaret didn't wait to hear more. She slammed her foot on the gas. The tires screeched as the car lurched forward, nearly clipping the man as he jumped back. She sped down the deserted street, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. The SUV in her rearview mirror didn't follow. Not yet. She had to find Michael. Margaret reached for her phone and dialed Olivia. "Mom, what's going on?" "Michael's in danger," she said, her voice shaking. "We need to get him somewhere safe. Now." "I'm on it," Olivia said without hesitation. "Where are you?" Margaret took a shaky breath. "Heading to Daniel's office. Meet me there." By the time she pulled into the small law office's parking lot, Daniel was already outside waiting. Olivia arrived moments later, her face pale with worry. "Where's Michael?" Daniel asked. "I don't know," Margaret admitted, glancing around nervously. "He ran when the SUV showed up." Daniel swore under his breath. "We need to find him before they do." Just then, Margaret's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Safe. For now. But they won't stop. Need to act fast." Margaret's hands tightened around the phone. Michael was right. Whoever was behind this wasn't going to let the truth come out easily. She turned to Daniel and Olivia, determination burning in her eyes. "Then we expose them first." Margaret sat in Daniel's office, gripping a cup of coffee she had no intention of drinking. Olivia paced near the window, peering outside every few seconds as if expecting someone to barge in. Daniel was on the phone, his tone urgent but controlled. Michael was still out there, hiding, and whoever was after him wouldn't stop until he was silenced. Margaret exhaled shakily. "We need to move fast. We have the truth, but it means nothing if we can't prove it publicly." Daniel hung up the phone and turned to her. "I just spoke with a reporter at the Sentinel. If we get Michael on record, we can publish the story before anyone can stop us." Olivia frowned. "But will that be enough? What if they try to discredit him?" Margaret set down her coffee. "Then we get more than just Michael. We find every person who had their cases handled by Carter Mills. If he did this to Nathan, there are others." Daniel nodded slowly. "That could work. If we show a pattern, we're not just fighting for Nathan. We're exposing a corrupt system." Margaret's phone buzzed again. Another message from Michael. "Meet me at 6th Street Bridge. No cops. No press. Just you." She showed the text to Daniel and Olivia. Daniel hesitated. "It's risky. If they followed him, this could be a trap." Margaret's stomach twisted. "I have to take that chance." Olivia touched her arm. "Then I'm coming with you." Margaret shook her head. "No. If something happens, I need you to stay safe, to make sure Nathan's story gets out." Olivia's jaw clenched, but she nodded. Daniel sighed. "At least take this." He slid a small recording device across the desk. "If things go south, we'll have proof of whatever said." Margaret pocketed it, her heart pounding. A half hour later, she pulled up to the bridge. The city lights shimmered in the distance, the hum of traffic below filling the night air. Michael stood near the railing, his hood pulled low over his face. She approached cautiously. "Michael," he turned, his face pale. "They're closing in, Margaret. I don't know how much time I have left." She stepped closer. "We have a way out, a reporter willing to publish your story. But we need more. We need others." Michael hesitated. "There are others. I've been digging." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket and handed it to her. 5 names, all locked up because of Mills. All of them swore they were set up. Margaret's breath caught as she scanned the list. These were real people, just like Nathan. Michael swallowed hard. "If I testify, they'll come for me." Margaret met his gaze. "Then we protect you. We do this the right way, out in the open. No more hiding." Michael looked away, fear flickering in his eyes. Then, slowly, he nodded. Margaret squeezed his hand. "We're going to bring them down." For the first time in 20 years, she felt hope. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls, meetings, and mounting tension. Margaret, Olivia, and Daniel worked tirelessly to gather statements from the other wrongfully convicted men. Each story was heartbreakingly similar. Fabricated evidence, coerced confessions, and a justice system that had failed them. Michael, despite his fear, agreed to go on record. The Sentinel published the explosive article, exposing not just Carter Mills, but an entire network of corruption that had buried innocent lives for decades. The response was immediate. Protests erupted outside the courthouse. Social media lit up with outrage, and national news stations picked up the story. Then, the real breakthrough came. The state's attorney general announced an independent review of Nathan's case, along with several others. Pressure mounted on officials who had long ignored the truth. A week later, Margaret received a phone call she had dreamed of for 20 years. "Mrs. Taylor," the voice said, "we're reopening your son's case." Tears streamed down Margaret's face as she clutched the phone. 3 months later, Nathan stood before a judge as his conviction was overturned. The courtroom erupted in cheers, but Margaret barely heard them. All she could see was her son, free at last. When he stepped outside, the first rays of sunlight bathed his face. He turned to his mother, his eyes filled with emotion. "You never gave up," he whispered. Margaret cupped his face, her voice trembling. "I never would." As she hugged him, Olivia by their side, she knew the fight wasn't over. There were still others like Nathan, innocent people waiting for justice. And Margaret Taylor wasn't done fighting.